Perfect timing. Okay. So looks like this question is, how can I set up a trigger to automatically run when a condition is met, i.e. field value changes to X? So that is a wonderful question there, Ken. I'm gonna actually just pop open a property record here and show you guys the differences between a task trigger and a property trigger. A lot of users that are just getting started with open to close are likely going to start out being task-based. The reason for that typically is you're coming from a task-based system. We want to make sure that adoption and implementation is going to go really well for your team, and then we can look at some of those additional features. So a task trigger is a trigger that is associated with a task. With that, I need to come in, check off a task, or have a task unchecked for a certain amount of time for that trigger to queue up or automatically go out. What you're talking through here, Ken, is what we would call a property trigger. So instead of having a task that this trigger is bundled in, instead, I'm going to have triggers that are kind of standalone. They're going to be watching for information on that property to update to then queue things up. So with these triggers, that's where we can add in some conditions. I'll show you the back end here in a second. I do want to clarify one thing with property triggers is it's going to have a slight difference than task triggers where we don't necessarily have an automatic option. Instead, when a trigger and the conditions are met, it's going to queue up and go to your health bar. So under this triggers tab, if you're on the scale plan, you will see this. If you are not on the scale plan, either a version 1 pricing or the Grow or Pro plans, you will not have this triggers tab. So please keep that in mind. But on our scale plan, you will see triggers here with a couple of different statuses, which allow you to come in and say, okay, here's all the triggers that are ready to go. I can go in, process those. My conditions may be met. And I just need to view, edit, and send. From there, I have my immediate tab, very similar thing, where I'm going to have those conditions that are met for that trigger to queue up. So this is likely where you'd want to be building, Ken, is in property triggers. This is where they would live on the property record when we've applied them and they're live. I'm not going to go too terribly deep into all these statuses because we could be here for a little bit on that, but we can send you our help article that goes through each of those in really good detail. To actually build them out, you're going to be under this hammer icon. Did I hit record? I did. Hammer icon, templates. Once we're in our template editor, if you're on our Pro or Scale plan, you're going to see this Trigger Templates tab. Under Trigger Templates, I have the option to create 3 different template types. When I click on this Add New, I'm going to see that type under this dropdown. I would want to make sure I select this property triggers type when I'm building out. This as the test. Now, when I create that template, it's going to give me the base. I can assign a category for my organization. Highly recommend that for all users if you're not using those categories already. But this is where we can build trigger functions. So very similar to adding a task trigger, I'm going to be able to say, do I want to send an email with this, send a text message, or am I adding or removing information for my property record? In this case, I'm just going to do an email. Now, as I do this, I can, again, like a task trigger, either directly tie in that email to the trigger itself, or I can apply a template. We typically recommend applying a template just because that's going to allow you to manage things a little bit easier. But for now, I'm just going to disregard that so I can show you the condition aspect, because that's, I think, what you're highlighting on. With this trigger, again, I'm not associating it to a task. What I'm doing instead is telling the system, I want this to queue up when these conditions are met. So instead, I'm going to have this add condition button here, where I can then choose my conditional type. Am I basing this off of a property field, a file role, or a contact role? So there are a lot of different strategies on the best way to set up property triggers, and oftentimes that really relates to the fields in your accounts is probably one of the most common things that we use for this condition logic. But again, I have the option for file roles, contact roles, etc. So typically what I would be asking myself is, when do I normally send out this email? Is it something that I would say I send based off of a status? So if the earnest money receipt equals to need to coordinate still, I would want to have an email template set up to go out to my buyer's agent and buyers for that. And I would probably have a field for that earnest money status to control things. So I'm going to use this for an example. I think I have a status field in this account for that. Use this seller disclosure delivery status instead. And in this case, I'm going to be able to choose my operator if this status is equal to not delivered, then I want this email to queue up for myself. And then maybe I have a separate email that I want to have queue up if the status equals delivered instead. So this is where that difference is going to come into play. Again, it's not based on me checking off a task. It's based on me updating this seller disclosure delivery status field. Very wordy. So with that, again, I'm basing things off of condition logic. So once those conditions are met, when I'm on my property, I just am following that number one rule in open to close. No read before bed. If I'm updating my information correctly, I can come to my queue and see all of the emails that I would be ready to send off based on the fields, file rules, contact rules in my account. Again, we can spend some more time on this subject just because there's a lot of different strategies, but if you have any follow-up questions to that, Ken, of just what particular types of processes you're trying to build with property triggers, feel free to put a follow-up in the chat and we can go over that in more detail. Otherwise, I think the next one regarding follow-up questions to conditions set. How do I get follow-up questions populated as soon as a yes/no question is answered? Is this a referral? Right now, follow-up questions are populating under the field section. Who is the referring agent? What is the fee, etc.? Do I just have to make it required? But then would that affect divisibility override the yes/no question? If I'm hearing that one correctly, it sounds like you're setting this up not only to add the fields to the property, but also as you're filling out the intake form. So Angelica, definitely correct me if I'm wrong on this, but let me pop over to the intake forms and show you that.
Yeah, it looks like
this is a great.
Yeah, the second question. Yeah, it's the intake form specifically that we're referring to right now. It looks like
Triggers in an intake form. What's the difference in selecting a trigger to be activated when form is submitted by agent and form? Great questions there. So let's dive into a few of those because that's kind of a multi-part question with our intake forms. Everyone, no matter what pricing plan you're on, should have access to intake forms. This is a great way to create your property records in the system and have a little bit more control over what information's added to those properties. I'm going to pull up a intake form that we have included in our pre-built account. If any of you guys are using that, you may see some similarities here, but with our intake forms, first thing we have here is our fields tab. And one of the main questions we get is, what fields do I select here? And the normal rule of thumb is, what fields do you need on your property record every single time? Those are the fields that we would want to have selected. And to your question there, Angelica, is there a referral? That is typically an intake question that would be asking every single time. So I would want to start out by coming over to one of those field groups, wherever you have that question living, and make sure that we are asking that every single time. So in this case, here is my question, is there a referral? In this left-hand column, this is telling the system what information do I want to have show up on that intake form when I'm filling it out. Whether it's the TC or agent, these fields control what's on the actual form. The green checkbox means that that field will be available to fill out. The red checkbox means that it is required to be filled out when I'm completing that intake form. If I have either of these boxes selected, rule of thumb again, is always make sure we have that green box on the right-hand side selected as well. This means that that field will also be added to your property when the form is submitted. If we don't add those fields to your property when the form is submitted, we will run into some issues down the line. So in this use case, I do have that selected. That means I'm asking this question every time. So the next piece of that is, what if I say yes, there is a referral? I want to have additional fields be required to fill out when I'm completing that intake form, which is going to be a form condition. Any fields that I bring to that form on a case-by-case basis, I'm using those form conditions to control when it's applied. So what I would do is come over to this tab And if I already have a pre-built form, I would just do a quick scan to see if that question is already inserted. In this case, it is. If it's not, you can easily add a new form condition with this add condition button, where we're going to use property fields to control what other fields are added. So in this case, I would just look for that referral question. Is there a referral fee? I will say is equal to. Now, one thing keep in mind with form conditions, I only has is equal to as an option. So we're always dealing with the positive here. From there, I would say I want to, yes, if there is a referral fee, I want to have additional fields brought in. Once that line item is added in, I can see all of those condition requirements I created, and then a edit actions button. This is where I can actually add in the assets. So what information do I want added to that form if I say yes, there is a referral? First drop down is those fields. So if I, like you said, want to be able to have them enter in the referral fee amount, I would likely have that be one of my field entries. Now, I could go a couple layers deep with this. Normally with some of our intake forms, I may have a couple of form conditions where I can say, okay, if there is a referral fee, is it a flat fee or is it a percentage? Now, you don't have to go this layer deep, but I personally like to. So then I would have this question being asked, is there a referral flat fee percentage? I would do another condition. And then in this case, I would find that field. If I say yes to flat fee, then I'm going to bring in, I went very quickly there, you guys, sorry about that. Now here's my line item, edit actions. Now I can add in those flat fee fields. And this just allows you to have, again, a little bit more control over that, because you may have some referrals where it is a set percentage or it is just a flat fee dollar amount. And so you are going to have different field types that we would be using for that, which is why I'm getting a little bit more granular here. Now, this is going to be whatever fields that you have specifically in your account that you need to track. So I would adjust this based on what you're seeing there. Otherwise, once I have my field added, I can also make that required here. So they have to fill out that flat fee or percentage amount every time. And I can also do the same thing with contact roles. If this is something that I generally have a hard time tracking down for my agents, or TCs, I can actually say you need to enter in who's receiving this referral when I fill out the intake form. Now, best practice, I don't know if I would do that every time because sometimes it does take a little due diligence to track down paperwork. So you may have this as a task once the form's submitted. Leave that up to you guys. But just say we did want to require that. This is where I can set up those settings. Now, one common misconception that we see here is I created the form conditions to add those to the intake form, but it does not mean that these fields have been added to my property. So you do need to keep that in mind. This lines up to your second part of the question is form triggers. When do I need to use form triggers? What are they there for? This is how we can add information to the property once the form is filled out. And that is the main difference between these two. So under your form triggers tab, you may see some triggers already in place if you're just getting started. One helpful thing that we generally recommend in implementation is expand your trigger options while you're here. It's going to show you more details on this screen. It's a little bit easier to navigate, find what you're looking for. If you're unsure of what triggers are in this intake form, another quick option is hitting the sort triggers button. When I select this, you can see all the triggers in my account, and I can see this detail section of what this trigger's function is. So this first one, I'm going to highlight this. I don't actually have any details entered on this trigger here, and it's showing up blank. So best practice, anytime in open to close, you see this details box here, make sure you have something inputted there to tell yourself what this trigger does. Small tangent over. To your question of when do I need to use a form submitted trigger versus a form approved trigger? Again, a lot of preference with that. Typically, when I'm adding field information to my property, I'm normally always going to add those on the form submitted side. We want to make sure those fields are actively on that property so they can be used in any condition logic down below. If the fields are not in your property, and I use one of those fields in my conditions that I'll show you here in a second, your trigger will not fire correctly. So that is always going to be the first thing that you guys should see when we look at your triggers lists is your fields first, field sections, and then we can add in other triggers for adding in template information. Now, when I'm looking at this list here, green means that this trigger is added when the form is submitted by the agent, or TC in this case. Anything in peach means that these triggers are applied when the form is approved. So if you guys haven't gone through that process already of testing an intake form and going through the approval process, really what it's doing is giving you a secondary screen for your TCs to go through and verify information on your property before we kick things off. So I don't want to get too tangenty on that per se, but if you have follow-up questions on the approval process, please post those up in Q&A and we can go over that in more detail. But again, applying things on the form approval, it's somewhat preference. So if I have my TC filling out a bunch of internally required fields as they're approving the intake form, I may wait to apply my triggers that apply my task templates, my document templates, my trigger templates until that form is fully approved to make sure all of my information is accurate. If my TC is the one filling out the intake form every single time, I'm probably not going to have a ton of internally required fields for them to fill out when they're approving the form. So hypothetically, I could apply my task templates, my document templates when the form is submitted. So that's something that, again, really tends to be preference on how you're doing the approval process, but we can dig into that a little bit further there here in a second. So looking at our triggers, to add a new trigger here, I'm going to hit that purple button where I can choose an action. I can always change this action type after the fact, so just keep that in mind. I'm going to build one off of the submitted side. As far as trigger functions, I can send an email, send a text, but typically I'm adding or removing information from my property through these triggers. So let me start with a field. When I'm adding a field here, this is going to be an individual field. So it's not pulling in the entire field section. This would be, I need to just pull in this one field right here. And oftentimes, the reason I'm doing this is because I need to use that field in some condition logic down below. So in this case, let's say I want to base this as off of my referral fee amount or percentage. I could add that individual field here as so, but it's not adding the entire field section. Now, let's say I wanted to require this field for my TC to review as they're approving the intake form. I can also change that drop down here from no to yes. Now, again, this is going to prevent your TC from approving the intake form until this field is filled out. So we do want to be mindful of this and not slowing your TCs down. Typically what we see is anywhere from no internally required fields to maybe under a half dozen, dozen internally required fields. We don't want to, again, pack that too much there because it can slow down that approval process and prevent you from kicking things off with your new file. So I wanted to throw that caveat in there. If you're using internally required fields for the approval process, make sure it's the most crucial ones that you need when you first start your file. Otherwise, once I have the assets in there, I can access those by clicking on this button. I can then view my condition logic for how this trigger is actually added to my property. So in this case, I'm just going to use seller disclosure date. I'm only going to add these fields here if I said, no, we did not waive the seller disclosure right. So this is going to be the power of intake forms where it is going to add in your fields, your processes based on whatever information is filled out on the front end of the form. So it's less clutter, less to-dos for you guys to clear up after the fact if you don't have that contingency or if you don't have this particular property type. Other types of triggers, again, I can send an email, I can send a text. Those are great for notification types. I wouldn't be doing that for my task emails and texts. This is just like notifications, new file submitted. The other type is adding in full field sections. Now with field sections, I generally am, I would say 99.9% of the time, never requiring an entire field section for my approval process. So this is just adding those fields to your property so you can then use them, make sure they're available for your team, not for the approval process. Now, one thing, and Hannah, please definitely chime in on this part too. I feel like I'm tangenting a bit, but we do see this question with intake forms a lot of removing information from your property versus adding. Typically, we found with implementation that it is easier to add, assets, whether it's fields, task templates, document templates to your property versus adding it all and then removing the ones you don't need. So if you have gone through and you've created triggers where you're removing information, it is okay. It's not necessarily a bad thing. I just do want to keep in mind that there are some different strategies that you'll see with intake triggers. And sometimes we have found that adding, again, information tends to work better than removing it. So, again, not good or bad either way. It's just the differences in strategies that we see as we're on these calls. So
yeah, the only time that I can see that a removal of a field might make sense is if you really, really don't want that individual field to show up for whatever reason. But I would try to think, why don't I want it to show up? Is it because I need to, maybe shift my fields and have this particular field or these group of fields in another section that only shows up on this specific area? Because keep in mind, when we're looking at our field sections, we do have different field groups. Those intake questions are typically on a completely separate field section. And so they don't usually show on that, default property view. So those are the types of things you have to think of when you're looking at it, is go, well, is it that I just need to change it so that it doesn't exactly where Jan is showing underneath the transaction details. And instead, it's okay if that field comes on, but I'd rather it be underneath one of these other field groups, like the intake questions or listing details or commission, depending on what you need.
Yeah. So field, a great point there. Field organization is a really helpful fact where even if you don't think you'll need it after the fact, you can always have it in a different field group. Not a great example here, but
exactly.
Intake questions. So it's not necessarily in your default list of fields, but maybe it's over in a field group that you can easily toggle to verify that.
Exactly. Yeah. A lot of the time I see people actually shifting their address, the property address, underneath the listing information, because that contract title, that's the full address. So you don't really need the fields showing you the address, but instead having it in a different area kind of tucked away works for them.
Yeah. Sorry. So to add or remove information and change that with your trigger assets, that's going to be this toggle here. By default, it's going to have it selected to add, but maybe we do want to remove this template, this field section. You can easily toggle that to remove. So main thing to keep in mind there is the last piece of this is just what condition logic are we using? We want to make sure that condition logic works for any assets that we have in this trigger. So if I'm adding or removing, it's based on whatever I create here. In this case, if the inspection contingency is waived, then I'm not going to add in any of my inspection tasks, inspection documents. If it isn't waived, no, then it's going to add it. So post any follow-up questions on that part if you can in Q&A. It does look like we have a follow-up with intake form conditions.
Yeah, Brittany has an awesome question here where it's I have fields that are pulling in based off of yes or no questions on the intake form. If the answer is no, I would not like these fields to pull into my property. However, if they're yes, I would. I can't find a way to make this happen without having them always pull into the file and remain blank. Any recommendations? So first things first that I'm going to say, let's actually look at your fields. So Jana, if you want to go to the fields underneath pages, on the intake form, my bad. Whenever we're looking at adding on or removing fields, or we only want them to come off of based on conditions, correct? So if you go ahead and click on transaction details, let's start with that. You can see here, address is one of those required fields. It's going to come on every single time. We want that to come on every single time. If we scroll down, there might be a couple other fields that we want to come on, but not all of them. Instead, we want to work off of the form conditions. So whenever you're talking about adding or removing fields, you'll see that a lot of the field sections in our fields are not coming on unless we're asking that particular question. So exactly where Jan is going, she's looking at her form conditions now. She sees that it says a question, is their HOA equal to yes? Let's stick with that one because most of you guys probably deal with that. Right now, the way it works is that if you answer that question, it only brings on the HOA due days to that intake form. Now, if Jana goes over to her pages and she looks at her HOA fields, I know, so, oh, no, still same place. Sorry, underneath pages, it says fields. There we go. Yeah. And if you scroll down to where HOA is, you're going to see that she doesn't have any of the HOA fields selected. They're not selected on the right-hand side or the left-hand side because we're going to work off of those conditions. So Brittany, if you're seeing that the fields are coming on regardless, check your fields here and see, okay, do I have it that they're all selected on, let's say, escrow details, perfect example. On the right-hand side, they're selected green. This means they're going to come on every single time, regardless of the logic that you're using. Now, if they're like the HOA details where none are selected, then instead what you'd want to do is build out that form condition and then also that form trigger to make sure that they're coming on. So if we go to form trigger now, I'm usually lazy. I like to use that Control F or Command F so that I can search. That's exactly what Jana did. It's what I train you guys to do. And here we can see those different triggers. So here we have that specific bringing on that field, because the way we've built it out is that we want specific critical dates to come on based off of our conditional logic from our intake form. So you'll notice the logic that you're using, is there an HOA equal to yes? That's going to be throughout the system, whether you're looking at your form conditions, your form triggers, your intake form conditions. Like there's quite a few other places that you can use this. So as Jana goes down and searches for all of them, here's that field section. And here's that task template trigger. And now that field section is built out. We don't need to have it selected on the underneath pages, underneath fields. Instead, we have a trigger saying, if there's an HOA, if HOA is equal to yes, then we want that field section. Let me know if there's any follow-up questions.
I'm gonna add one last thing to that.
Yeah, that too. Yeah.
I think part of it, and again, there's a lot of preference that comes into field organization as well. Part of it is those questions that we ask every time on an intake form. We call them intake questions. You guys may see it slightly differently in your account, but if you come into hammer icon here, your field editor, you're going to see your defaults field group, but you should see this purple button. You hover over that, it will show you all the other field groups in your account. If this is a yes, no question, Brittany, that you're asking every single time for your intake forms, and you don't necessarily want that in your transaction details field group, you may consider putting it over here. So that way we can ask that on the intake forms. We can keep that on your property record because it's used in so many different condition logics. But it's not in that default view for you in your everyday processing of that transaction. So let's say you do have a field under your details or listing details group that you want to move over. You can either select that field and then you're going to see this move option, or you can just select the field title and you're going to see this field section here where you can then change that placement. So in the very light gray, when you're under this drop down, this is the field group that these field sections live in. So I would just scroll down until I find that intake questions field group, and then the field section I would want to put it in. So that may be another helpful piece just to keep those yes, no questions out of the everyday view, but still, again, using it in that logic like Hannah was just showing.
Absolutely. I think the only other thing I'd add to that is showing that you can move that entire field group as well. Up at the top, if you click groups and then sort groups. So just in case it's not an individual field, but it's a whole field section that you want to shift over. So like example, I said that address, I've seen a lot of people nowadays move that over to the listing details because they don't necessarily need it on the front page. They want it there, but if they need it, they can toggle to that specific, drop down on the property. Or they shift it to the bottom too. This is also where you can come in here and you can reorder those fields so that it matches more of what your actual contract looks like. I know that contracts are all unique. So, HOA, home inspection, and then repair, those could be in a completely different order than what they are at default in your system.
Yeah, no, that's good. Let us know if there's any follow-ups to that one. It does look like we have a question on property triggers here. I have a trigger set up as you described, but it shows as in process, and I have to manually go in and hit execute when the condition is met. It does not trigger automatically. So that is the main difference that we see with task triggers versus property triggers is they will always be going up to your queue when those conditions are met. And so there's a couple of places that you could potentially see this trigger ready to go. One of those is directly on your property, where you can see those trigger statuses here. When we come to our in-process triggers, we are going to see a couple of triggers where potentially not all of the conditions have been met, I believe is the status. And so you may have those where it's actually saying, hey, this field does not have that condition equaling this just yet. So we may have to update that field in order for it to fully queue up. So that's one thing that if you guys ever have a trigger in your account where it's like, this hasn't gone to my trigger pipeline, it hasn't gone to my health bar, I thought these conditions were met, I would try and find that here in this list, expand your trigger options, and you're going to be able to see what that condition is and if there's anything that is preventing it again from queuing up.
Can you click on ready to go really quickly? Can we see the conditions for that? Yeah, so that must be it. It must be like waiting and listening.
Mm-hmm. When in process, I believe is actually, I'm going to clarify because my brain is a little foggy today, but it's waiting for timeline to also match up with everything. So
right,
that's
because
where,
it could be a scheduled text message. You're correct. You're correct.
Mm-hmm. One of my favorite articles, I reference this a lot because my noggin is not what it used to be, but I will just do a quick search for property, or I'm actually going to do trigger statuses. And that should be able to pull up this article right here. It's one of my favorites, again, just because it gives that really detailed breakdown of everything that's included. I'm going to post this up in, oh, I don't know if
The
I can
chat?
type answer. I'm going to send this to you, Hannah, so you can add that in to the Q&A. So that way you can have that reference article, Ken. I bookmark it, so that way I can quickly toggle it over. But that is the one thing that I would look at there is, have the conditions been met? And is my timeline correct for when this trigger should queue up? Once those conditions are met and the timeline is ready to go, again, it goes to your health bar. So that way you can see all the triggers that you have in queue ready to go that you need to edit, proof, send out. So if you're working on the property directly, your health bar, anytime you see anything in red, no red before bed is the rule of thumb. So that means you have something to do there. I would open up that health bar, review those triggers, tasks, etc., and execute if I can. The other place to view this information is out of your trigger pipeline. So the idea is, let's say I have an update on my transaction. I just received word that earnest money has been delivered. I'm waiting on that receipt. For me as a TC, I would find my property record, actually go back to one. I would change my status to delivered, waiting on receipt. I would put in the date for earnest money received date because I personally like to track that. And then I would move on to the next thing in my queue because I've updated my fields. I'm waiting on my receipt. Once I get my receipt, I'll update it to my documents template, but that's what I would do when I get those updates. And because I changed that earnest money status, naturally things should just queue up for me because I've told the system, here's where I'm at with my property record. So as you guys get those updates throughout your day-to-day, those documents coming through, maintain your fields, maintain those file roles, and you can just live out of your trigger pipeline. Because as things queue up, it will come into this pipeline. You can see anything that is ready to go out immediately, can easily inspect, edit that email, send it. You can also see anything that's past due today, due tomorrow, or in the future. So that's typically what the flow would look like in your particular use case, Ken. If you wanted to get a screenshot or video of what you're running into and send that into support, we may want to take a deeper look at how yours is set up to be able to answer that a little bit more clearly for you. Next question, when we have an email trigger, oops, that screwed it up. Email trigger from the intake. The personal email is the only field that picks up to send the triggered email. If there is only a personal email, we get an error of API not found 400. What is the issue we need to correct? Okay, let me reread that again. Okay, I think I may be picking up what you're throwing down there. So let me hop over to the intake here. Definitely chime in if there's an additional piece to this there, Erica, but it sounds like you're trying to send an email from the intake form triggers. So again, correct me if I'm wrong on that, but let's take a take a look at that, because this question does come up, especially in implementation when we're talking through build outs of how this works. So I mentioned it earlier, I'm going to do it right now. If I need to change this trigger to not go out on the approval side, let's say I want to go to the submitted side instead, just select your contingency. It's going to give you a drop down where you can just quickly toggle that if you need to put it on the submitted side versus the approval, etc. Now, form submitted emails and text messages. When this form is submitted, that does not mean all of my information is on my property yet. Form submitted is as soon as we hit that submit button, it takes about a minute max for the system to fully process that, and it's submitted. Whether or not I approve it, like that is the difference between the two. So if I have my fields being added to my property with the form submitted, I'm adding my contacts to my property when the form is submitted. Not all of that information may be there for this email to pull it in when it's sent out. So on form submitted emails, there's a couple of things to keep in mind, and the system will actually flag you in red here. We do not recommend using merge fields in form submitted emails, text messages, because there is no guarantee that those fields are on your property yet, which means that they may not pull in to this message going out. So typically for form submitted messages, it is a very neutral notification, likely going out to your team. And I say it's likely going out to your team because the second piece to this is I don't have the option to hard code in contact roles because I don't, again, have that guarantee they're on my property just yet. So I'm actually going to tie in a hard coded email address to any form submitted emails that I'm creating, or if it's a text, hard coded phone number. So that is the main difference that we really like to stress here is this is purely a notification saying new file received. Log into your open to close account for more details. Now, if I'm sending out a notification email when that form is approved, it is slightly different. When I toggled that now, the contingency, the form is approved, and I click on this email, I'm going to see a slightly different screen, one that you're probably already used to because this is what we see when we're building email templates. I'm going to have the option to hard code an email, but I can also choose contact roles that I may want to deliver this message to. I can also use merge fields now, as long as those fields are on my property record. The main thing with this is what's my use case? Why would I build in an email form submitted to the intake form versus a task template versus a property trigger? It's really an immediate notification versus me checking off something to say I'm ready to send it out. So typically, if you're putting those in the intake form, it is because it is a notification message, not an intro email to your clients type of thing. So I hope that clarifies the issue. What I would try in your use case there, Erica, is just seeing if you try a different email address on that trigger, is it still producing the same error? If so, I would, again, screenshot, recorded video. If you guys can send those in with your support tickets, it really does help out the team see what you're seeing, what steps, clicks you're taking to recreate those issues so we can help out more efficiently and effectively. So if you can submit that to the support team, Erica, we'll dig in further and let you know what we can find.
The only other thing that I would add to this is see where it says use property default send from email address.
Oh, yes.
If you go ahead and go to the dashboard, Jana, and if you go to email addresses, if you do not have an email address selected here, and so if both of these were gray, then we would have an issue because we do need a default email. So you'll have to make sure that you have a default email. And sometimes when you initially set up your account, you have it synced and you're bringing in stuff, not all the time do you have that default email selected, but that could also be it, especially since it says the API not found 400. So definitely make sure you have that default email set up or selected. And Jen, if you want to show her, it's just a quick clicking on the default button and boom, there you go. It's there. That's your default email. And it's going to use that email to send out. Otherwise, it can't send out. It doesn't have an email to send it out from, technically. That would be the only other thing I would want to add.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, that's something that if you guys have not already, definitely make sure you're setting up those email connections. We do highly recommend doing a Google Workspace or Microsoft connections. That way it's connected through the API. versus a non-API email address. The difference between the two is if it's a non-API, that email is sent through our servers. It still will come from you, but we're getting the right to delivery, which is how we can bypass that API connection. If you have an API connection, it is sent through, in this case, your Google server, which is why it's going to have that slight difference with how it looks and also deliverability. So highly recommend using that API setup for emails. And then on the property itself, you can designate your default property email address if you need to have that change for the agents or teams you're working with. So you can always toggle that here on the property itself as well. That was a really good point there, Hannah. Thank you.
No worries.
For tasks due on weekends, we have changed our default settings in the property to roll back for both options. However, our tasks still show due on Saturday or Sunday. Doesn't the default override the individual tasks and changes apply the due dates of all tasks? So defaults and settings. With this, I have had a couple of questions come through myself. Hannah, Matthew, please feel free to chime in on this as well. With defaults and settings, this is going to apply for what it says here, dates, property dates, and task dates. So unless I'm using a date template to override what I have here in my defaults and settings, it is going to use this for a reference. The caveat to that is, and I may lose some of you guys if you have not gotten into date templates yet, we do have some really good articles on this. Feel free to keep posting those questions in our channel here, but date templates allow us to use a days field and a default calculation to say when the actual date is due. So if I come into this HOA due date, I'm saying default is 10 calendar days after contract acceptance is when the HOA due date is typically due. I have given myself an override days field in case I need it. But my weekend roll, federal holiday roll, these selections here, if I have this to NA on my date template, and I apply that date template that has defaults and settings that say roll forward, roll back, it's not going to keep the NA here. It's actually going to observe what we have in the defaults and settings. So that's one thing I would take a look at for your setup there, Erica, is just, are you using a date template for any of these due dates for your tasks? If so, that could have a secondary measure of when it's doing that roll forward, roll back.
Yes.
And then from there, very similar flow with creating the task templates as well. I have the option on my task due date, this one as an example here, to control that roll over, roll forward. Again, NA is going to still observe that defaults and settings if we roll forward, roll back. So I probably would want to take a deeper look on that one as well, Erica, just to see what your particular setup looks like to give a more accurate answer there. So if you want to include that in on the ticket to support, we can take a deeper look with you.
Yeah, it's a trickle down situation. So if you haven't set it up in your templates, then it's going to go off of whatever's on the property default. If you didn't set it up on your intake form, then it'll default to what you set up on your property. If you didn't set it up on your tasks, default to property. Document date templates default to property. That's what it likes to do. So like even on the intake form, Jana, if you want to show, there is an area underneath settings where you can say, do I want things to roll forwards or backwards for my date calculation? So depending on where, you're having it applied, but here's where that, weekend or federal holiday roll is as well. Something that I've seen pop up, and just because we're looking at it, I want to mention it. When we're talking about skipping federal holidays, it's specifically for counting, not for landing on counting. So if Jana were to select NA and she were to say count federal holidays, we would be counting New Year's as a true date. Yeah, that's one out of all of the calendar days that I need to count to get that date calculation. That came up just recently, and so I just wanted to make sure I added that on there.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, so it doesn't look like you're using date templates, it sounds like. So yeah, if you can maybe do a Loom video on that one, Erica, just showing the particular property and templates that you are using. That information should help quite a bit as we take that deeper look. Good questions coming through today. Love it. Next question, is there a way to organize the doc templates once the property loads from the intake? We have the initial set of buyer docs required and then add special conditions like HOA and solar. The solar may show up between the files and the original docs templates. which is strange. We would like to have them auto load in a certain way. Can we do that? So it's been a minute since I've taken a look at this one. Let me pull up a property here. I know we have the option with tasks to do user sorted versus, what's it called? My brain is stalling. User sorted versus date sorted. That is an option with tasks. I personally like to do date sorted so I see what's up and coming. As far as documents go, when the document templates are applied to your property, your folders that are included, they may have a slightly different order. I have seen that myself. Matthew, if you have any additional points on that one with support, definitely feel free to add those. But typically what I like to do, because there may be some organization where this folder is further down in my list than I had created. I think it's going alphabetical.
It does go off of
Yes.
alphabetical. Yeah. Unless
So
you go
what-
into the default and settings and change it. So that could be it.
Yes, thank you. So one thing with that, and this is just a best practice with documents and folders in open to close, because you will start to see that you may have a couple of different folders if you're dealing with all possible contingencies for that transaction. With this, let's say my contract counteroffers addenda. This is something I'm normally checking when I first get my file. And once I confirm all of those documents are received, my purchase contract, my counteroffers, etc., I have uploaded, I've done all of my steps, I do have the option to collapse my folders and color code. So this is something that Andrew actually recommended when we were first starting. I just love this, where using the color coding on your folders allows you to quickly see, okay, with contract counteroffers and addenda, say use this green to say, I've done everything for this folder. It is good to go. I no longer need to do anything with these file types. I can quickly set that color coding and collapse those files. So that way I don't have as long of a list to scroll through. I can come in, quickly find the folder that I'm looking for, and then see all of those documents within it. And again, no, if I expand this, I don't have anything left to do. Just would be expanding it to look at the files in there. So that may be an option for organization there and just quickly seeing the different folders in your account. You do have the option to expand all or collapse all as well. Now, to Hannah's point there, we do have global settings. I can't remember if it's under this tab.
File sorting.
Yes. So file sorting versus user sorted, you do have that global setting that you can select here. That way, maybe it's not alphabetical, it is user sorted. So you may try toggling that on to user sorted to see how that looks this next time you create that property.
The only other thing that I might suggest, and I've seen that this has come up as kind of a thing that a lot of people are wanting to do, because when you get that file started and you have all of these file roles there and they're just waiting, but maybe these certain documents come up like later on in the process of you like processing that transaction. I've seen a couple people build out in their task templates that when they mark off a specific trigger, it then applies the document template when they need it. So for example, you might not want your repair addendums to come on unless you need repairs. And so we've gone to our inspection task list and we've created a very specific task that says, do we need repairs or are repairs necessary? And upon task completion, it can trigger up and it can say, okay, now we're going to apply that document template for the repair addendum. That way I can make sure I'm tracking it. That's one thing I would suggest too, if you're finding that initially we want the buyer's doc template to come on. I want to make sure we're putting that all in there, but I want HOA and solar to come on when I'm ready to process those. Maybe you take care of that 3 or 4 days into the transaction. So you want your document templates to be a little bit cleaner. You can build out a trigger to say, bring on this particular document template when I'm ready. So Jan is showing you here, I think post occupancy is a really good example. Yeah, post occupancy is a great example. So here it's bringing on those tasks. If you click on template, you can add on the tasks, you can add on the document templates, you can add on a date template. Now, obviously we wouldn't suggest putting on a date template, but you can add on those task templates, you can add on those document templates. And let's say you're using a combination of the task templates plus some property triggers, you can also add the property triggers onto a task template in case maybe you need a use case for that. I don't want you guys to feel like you're restricted when you're looking at those triggers. If it says templates, that means it means all of the templates, not just, task templates.
Yeah. That's good. Yeah, and there's a few like repairs. That's a great example where not every inspection is going to result in repairs being offered requested.
Mhm.
Maybe it's a seller credit. Maybe it's waived at that point. So like we see here with this, was post occupancy requested? We have this question being asked on the intake form, but we also put in a secondary measure to double check after the fact, because for me as a TC, I had a couple of sellers, buyers that we would negotiate it, a week after, like, hey, could we actually do a post occupancy? So you can create some of those reminders later on in your file to still add and remove, like Hannah's saying. So that way you still have that control to really expand on your property and your transaction based on what's being negotiated interrupting. So really, really good point there. Next question, if you are the buyer's agent, are you putting in the phone number, emails, addresses for listing agent, listing TC, lender, title company? I'm assuming you aren't putting that on the intake form. Great question there. So it really depends on where your information is coming from. So let's say I am working with a team where I have all of my information living in an outside system that I can't connect through a native integration like Follow Up Boss. I may have under this contacts tab, some of my contact roles being required. So I have to fill out and add in the buyer's information every single time I fill out this intake form. There may be some instances for the information on the other side. Let's say I'm dealing with the sellers. I don't have the lender's information just yet. It's kind of case by case. If I know I'm not going to have that information on the intake form, I'm not going to require that to be entered here. So I would just think through your strategies as a team of when am I going to actually get this contact information for this deal. Let me actually just throw some quick details in here. So I can show you what it looks like to add contact information on the form itself.
You should be able to push through after putting in the address. So you
It
might not
doesn't
have
ever
to.
let me.
Because I know it gets mad if the address isn't in there, but it might. Okay, cool. Awesome.
Yeah. So when you're entering in contact information, I mentioned it just a minute ago. Well, if you're a Follow Up Boss user and you are working with that native integration, you will have some extra capabilities when it comes to adding in those contact details. So let's say my agent is filling out this form or my TC. I have the option to select a contact from my contact database. Now, this is going to be dependent on the permissions you have set for contact sharing. So please keep that in mind if your agents are the one filling this out. Otherwise, I have the option to add new contact information here. You will see some basic contact detail fields. This is not everything that you can add to a contact record though. So once I enter in these details, my form is submitted. Let's say I want to add some additional contact information to those records. You can always come into the system, find that contact, say it's Pam, and then my admins can fill out any of those additional details for the team. If this contact is in FUB, I do have that option to import my contact details from my connected FUB account too. So if you're a FUB user, your agents are a FUB user, and you're using Open to Close, would highly recommend looking at this integration, because this is just one of the ways that it can save you and your team time, but also really make sure that your databases, the data in your Open to Close file is as accurate as possible, and your agents are still able to see those insights in their Follow Up Boss account for the deal in Open to Close. So
correct me if I'm wrong, Jenna. When you import from Follow Up Boss here too, and you select that contact, it should add it underneath that Follow Up Boss integration as well on the property, right? Like it makes that connection there instead of you having to search for the contact later, like after the fact on the property.
Depending on your settings, there may be some FUB details that we can set by default, but it would associate it to the contacts tab. I can then come over and easily use some of those FUB integration details. And then from there, I can tell the system how I want to sync any of that data to those records in FUB.
Okay, fantastic.
So,
yeah.
Yes.
That's a point for Jen because she uses FUB. So that's why I asked it too.
Yeah, I would say we had a webinar not too long ago. I'm going to actually pull up our help center on this. And we have updated our help articles on this. So if you actually come over, there should be a FUB collection of articles where you can see the main FUB details that you guys can be doing. Let me snag this link and I'll get that posted up for you. I would highly recommend taking a look through those because there's quite a few other features that you can utilize with that integration. Just with the sake of time, I don't know if we're going to be able to go over all of those. So hope that answers your question there, Jen, Joe. Let me know if there's any follow-ups. Next question is, when inputting a property, is there a way for the fields to go down the page instead of left to right, like reading a book? Great question. Let me actually open up the intake form and show you guys something here. Typically, when I'm looking at some of my fields on a intake form, I have a few ways that I can have those appear. The first option is a drop down for your choice field. Now, if I have a choice field that has over, I think my personal rule of thumb is like 10 choice options, can vary. I like to keep the drop down. If it's a field that maybe it's just a yes or no question being asked, I don't necessarily like the drop down. It's more clicks for myself. So you guys do have the option, I'm going to toggle here, under your hammer icon in your field editor, to come to those choice fields that you would be asking on the intake form. When you select it, you're going to have the option here to display as radio buttons. So this can be really, really helpful for not only saving you time, but just creating a little bit more of an efficient view when you're looking at the forms. So that way it's more of a one click to say yes or no on that question versus the two. Now, to your actual question that you have there, Lacey, how do I get it to read up and down versus left to right? So in this case, this is not two questions being asked. This is a long list. I want to use a stack option if I want those to be listed out top to bottom versus left to right. So using that inform stack can be very, very helpful for the ones that are more than just two yes or no questions being asked. I also have the option to just say, I just want the radio buttons to display. So I'm going to update those two and show you what that looks like on the form itself. While I'm doing this,
You should be able to refresh.
I'm just going to touch on it really quickly while we're here. If we made a change to the back end where maybe I added in or changed the field information, the contact roles, the documents, there are times where you guys may need to cancel your form and start fresh. So that way that information refreshes on this page. There are some instances like this where I just made a small tweak. I can hit the refresh button up top. It will reflect that change. But if I made a bigger change, like I added in an additional field to the form, I need to hit this cancel form button in the bottom right corner. So just keep that in mind. Let's say you went through and you made some changes and it's not reflecting. It's because we need to clear and then fill out a new form. In this case, I'm just doing a quick refresh. So here's what that radio button stack option looks like when it's going up and down. And then here's what that stack option, radio button option looks like without the stack, where it's still reading left to right, but it is a little bit easier for me to say yes or no. So that's likely what I would look into there, Lacey. If you have follow-up questions on that, definitely let us know. In reference to emails, is there a way to add my email so that it is always blind CC'd on every email that I send? What a wonderful question. I love this. So
one thing I would say before we go for this one is, Lacey, is the email that you're sending out emails from, is it an API connected Google email? Because if it is, then that's going to be in your sent box in your Gmail. If you need to BCC a separate email that is not an open to close, then you can use a contact role for that. Is that what you were going to go for, Jana?
Yeah, I was going to show kind of both options, like
options.
there of just like scanning and everything.
Okay, good. API.
Perfect.
Cool.
Yep. So with the API connection, and another reason why we recommend using that is because it's going to give you some additional capabilities in the system. Like Hannah's saying, if you have an API connected email and you're sending emails from this property, you should see that history inside your email inbox. Now, what if I want to see some of my history from my email inbox in my property record, like vice versa? With the API connected email, you do have the option here to scan your emails. Let's say I have all the emails for this property going into this label. I can choose the label that I have for 2190 Royal St. George's Lane. and then sync those emails in. I also have the option to scan my emails through that label as well. So that can be pretty helpful if you are still having some of those emails come into your inbox and not directly open to close. But typically, when you send from open to close, you should still see that history tracked there. The second option, like we were mentioning, is your contact roles. There will be some instances where I need to always include this person as a CC on all buyers' emails or all emails for this property. That is going to be a great tool for contact roles. So hammer icon, filters, you're going to see your contact roles as the first option. And most users, if not all users, typically are starting out with some default contact roles in their account. So you likely will already see these to use. So CC on all emails, blind CC on all emails. You're going to see that for some of the different contact roles in your account. So let's say I have this use case where I have an additional party member that's helping out my clients as they buy their first property. They're not, physically on the sale, but they do want to be included in some of those emails. I could add that contact to my property and assign them this CC on all buyer emails contact role. The next step that I would want to do is make sure that in any buyer email templates that I have in my account, I mean any buyer emails, I would just make sure that I have that CC on all buyer emails option selected. And then under blind CC, same concept, I'm going to have that selected. So if I have someone on my property with that contact role, they would be included in this correspondence because by default, I have that set up. So that would be something that, again, if you need that secondary measure, it's not through the API email, that is a great use case for those contact roles. If you have not played around with contact roles yet, to assign them to a contact on your property, come over to this contacts tab. You're going to see their contact role right here in the top right corner. You can always change that, adjust it as needed. Next question, any advice on how to get the Google or Microsoft emails to connect properly? Me, myself, and two other team members in the team are not able to send emails from any address other than the non-API emails. I would want to see and clarify, are you using the Google Workspace to connect things? With Google especially, it does need to be a Google Workspace account for it to connect through the API. Mm-hmm. If it is a standard at Gmail, it cannot be connected through the API in the system. And so that is one thing I would take a look at. If you are having issues on connectivity, I would highly recommend reaching out to our support team so that way they can take a deeper look and troubleshoot with you if needed. But that would be the first thing that I would look at is Workspace or not Workspace.
Part two is for Microsoft. If you were receiving that Microsoft domain or that email from, let's say, your brokerage, and your brokerage has specific security permissions, you might not be able to use that Microsoft email for the integration with an open to close. You might have to reach out and say, hey, brokerage, can you add open to close as in, like green light them as okay to use, and set up that API connection. So that could be part two, but definitely reach out to support so that we can help you get that set up.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. So next question, is there a way to stack the fields in the property before we do the intake form? So if I'm hearing this one correctly, a couple of things I would want to clarify. I wouldn't have a property yet until that intake form is filled out. So typically I start with the intake form, and that is how I create the property record and how those fields are added to my property record. Because I likely already have a value selected in those fields that I'm starting out with, it's just going to show me that value here on my property versus the full drop down of all of the choice options that I could see on the intake form. If I don't have a value set, I'm going to be able to click on that and it would give me the option to input it. So let's say I'll toggle over to my intake questions. I don't have one. If you don't have a field on your record, this is my test demo account. You can always come in, hit that manage fields, and it will add it in for you. Just want to have one I can take a peek at. So this is a choice drop down. I don't have a value set. If I need to set a value, it is going to default to a drop down window here because I'm going to have more things that I can set. Maybe I want to color code that option. Maybe I want to set a priority for it. So There is not going to be the stack view per se once the property is created. It is generally just for that intake form view. But on your property, there's going to be some slight differences and some easier things that you can use to update those fields in your day-to-day. One of my favorite things, if you guys do not use this already, highly recommend playing around with the open to close shortcuts.
Oh yeah.
Control G when you are on a property. I'm going to repeat that again. Control G is going to open this window where I can easily search any of the fields that are on my property in this account. So in this case, I found my closing date. It currently says 11/28/22. If I want to quickly update that, I just have to select it and I can change that information here. So as you guys are getting those updates on your files, you need to update one of your fields. Instead of trying to search through this list or those field groups, Control G is your best friend. So,
and that's just if you're viewing the property. If you're in the task pipeline, you can quickly toggle over and search the fields in the same exact way, and add in the fields there. Same thing with the trigger pipeline. If you need to add in, let's say you're looking at a merge fields missing from an email and you need to add it on, you don't have to go to the property to add that on. You can add it from that view.
Do that. Yeah, so if you're on the Pro Scale Plans version 2, you're going to see some additional options down here. So yeah, if I need to send an email, see some of those property details, you can do that from those pipelines as long as you have those filter views selected. So if you don't see what I'm seeing here with tasks, click on this little funnel icon. You're going to have the option to select some of the different things that you'd want to have show up on that card. So you can have it be a little bit more custom for you and your team.
Property options is the one that you're going to want. And you see how it's got that email, that house icon, and then the little search, the little, what do they call them? Magnifying glass. That's the one where you can type in whatever you want and you can add it on. Now, if the field doesn't show up, that could mean that the field is not included on the property. So if you're searching, you're like, why isn't this field showing up? I know I have this field. It could be because that field has just not been added to the property. And so you might need to click on the house icon, manage the fields, and then make sure that that's actually added to the property.
We have some really good questions coming through, so we are going a little bit over our normal time today. So I would say if you guys have any questions, get those posted up, and then we're going to wrap after this last round here. So let us know if you have any follow-ups on that option for viewing those fields. It does look like we have a follow-up to the email option.
I wasn't sure if this was.
So yeah, there are some differences with how you're going to see some of that data if you're transitioning from TC workflow there. So if you ever have questions on functionality or the differences between the two systems as you're doing that migration process, definitely reach out, ask support. We can always clarify that with you. But yeah, that API email really does give you some extra capabilities in the system, making that a little bit smoother. So we do have a follow-up on that contact role question of who are we in the system? I want to blind copy myself on one intro letter always. So when I look at a property, and this is a good question, I have a couple of different ways to see who's assigned this property versus who is a part of this property. So when I'm looking at assignment, there's two places that I can view this. In the top right corner, I can click on my agent portal user's name. It's going to show me the team user assigned to this file, the team that's assigned to the file, and then the email. If I want to see more details, I do have a Manage Property Access button here, which will take me to that access screen. Otherwise, I can hit that More tab. I'm going to see Access under Utilities, takes me to this screen where I can see my portal users. Now, this gives them portal access to my property. I'm not going to go terribly deep into that. If you guys have not looked into portals, I would pull that up as a keyword in our Help Center. But this is where I can, again, control access. Now, my Contacts tab, this is going to control who am I working with in this transaction. This Contacts tab is not only good for the reference information of quickly seeing Andy's email, phone number, giving him a call, email, text, etc. But I can also come through and again assign those contact roles so that way they can be included on my correspondence. So that's the main thing with contacts that we add here is if I want to include someone in an email, in a text message, I need to be able to assign them a contact role and associate them to this property. So for you, Dale, in that instance, I would add you as a contact to the property. Now, if you're the one who's the transaction coordinator versus maybe the compliance manager, I would make sure we have a contact role set for that. So you can include yourself on any of the emails that you would need to as the TC. So in this case, that intro letter every single time. So if you have not created a contact role, or if you don't have a contact role for that, hammer icon, filters, I see contact roles here. I would just do a quick scan. So we mentioned it earlier, I'm on a Mac, so I hit Command F. If you're on a PC, it's Control F. It's going to open up your browser's search bar. So you can just do a keyword search. It's going to help you look for lists like this a little bit easier. In this case, I see that buyer transaction coordinator contact role. If I scroll down, I would also see one for seller TC. So that's likely what I would end up doing. So that way, again, I can associate this contact role to those intro letters that you're sending. Next question, what's the link again to watch webinars tutorials on basic setup of just starting open to close as a new open to close customer? I want to watch setup step-by-step tutorials if possible and didn't know what the best ones would you recommend. That is a wonderful question. And I'm going to preface this with our team is actively working on adding some content and kind of revamping our content that we have in our help center. So I would expect to see some changes here in the new year with the content that we're going to be supplying to you guys. We will be doing an announcement with those updates. But generally what I find is pretty helpful is coming over to this support center if I'm just digging into learning, because then I can do a quick search for anything that I'm looking for. I can look at our video onboarding series, our webinars, articles, etc. These getting started videos, I've heard a lot of great things on this. I do want to preface with we have had some significant changes in the system in this last month. So version 2 features are not going to show up in these getting started videos just yet. That is what we're working on. If you do have questions, though, on new features, keyword searches are going to be, again, one of your best friends here because it's going to allow us to narrow down those results and find the articles that relate to that topic. In this case, I just need an overview on commission reporting. So I would look for that article. What we're trying to do is give quick links. So if you have a specific question on what is a top level step? I just want to understand that piece of it because I understand the widgets, I understand the title logo. You can easily click that link. It'll take you down to that portion of the article where you can then see the details for the question that you specifically have. So that's where everyone is going to have a slightly different start to open to close. You may be coming from one system where, again, you may be task-based versus another user is coming from a system where they're going to start out trigger-based because they have those types of automations. So I wouldn't say there's going to be a shoe that fits all when it comes to initial setup. I would say start with those onboarding videos, and then as you have questions, continue to come into the help center, do those quick keyword searches, because you should find an article that relates to it, and then those quick links for the section you need to review. The other option,
sorry.
I was going to say the other option is to do that directly within the system with our current chat window that we see. So.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I know that for Jen specifically, you have access to that customization checklist that kind of goes through and shows like the order in which we would best suggest searching through and looking over and customizing open to close. You can use the order that checklist is in to also kind of search in our help center for what you need to do. So start with similar to exactly what Andrew says on most of these Wednesday workshops, start with your fields, your file roles, your contact roles, because you know the things you need to track, you know the people you work with, and you know the files you pay attention to. Start looking through your tasks after you feel good about those updates. You're probably always going to go back to referencing your fields. That's pretty common for anyone who's getting started or continuing to grow within their system. After you're good with your tasks, check out your email templates. From there, you can jump into your document templates and then date templates, and then check out that intake form. Depending on when you signed up, you could have access to some of the pre-built stuff. If anyone has access to the pre-built stuff, if they see that there's 2 intake forms in their account and they created their account, what was it, after December 11th? Am I right? Is it December 11th? please feel free to reach out to support. We do have that guide that we can give you access to if
Mhm.
you are looking for something that's a little bit more meaty, instead of looking through our support center. A lot of that is written content, but that's why I'm saying that you can still use the same order in which you need to sort of learn open to close by using the same order, but you can search in our help center for like specific videos if reading is something that can be difficult to digest for you. That's all I was going to add.
You know, we're hoping to get that into our knowledge base too, so that way you guys don't have to go to an outside system for some of our implementation training. But yeah, like Hannah's saying, we have created a customization guide with our implementation team and what we have included in the pre-built account. So if any of you guys do not have access to our Kajabi materials and have the pre-built information, or are unsure if you have the pre-built information, feel free to reach out to support. Let us know that you're looking to get connected with that, and then we can get you access there.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And then again, in the near future, we're going to see that come in to one system where you guys can see those customization guides with our general help articles as well. I know we, again, are over time, so if you guys need to hop off, again, this is recorded. You can always come back to it too. But I'm just going to go through the rest of these questions really quickly here. I was hoping I could send a screenshot of the new property dates on what I'm meaning. I can just email the help desk though. Yes, anonymous attendee, I would say if you have a screenshot, questions, yeah, feel free to submit that in a ticket to our support team. We'll be able to dig in a bit deeper. But it looks
Also
like there's
look
a
up one
follow-up.
sheets. Look up one sheets.
Yeah, can you please show how we can integrate Google Sheets to keep a database of our intake form? I would be curious of use case on that, as far as just being able to see intake forms in a spreadsheet and what data you would want to have presented there. There is a couple of ways to approach that. If you're just needing to have a notification that a new property is created, I would probably consider just doing a email trigger and parsing that, depending again on what you need. If you're trying to send property data out of open to close to, let's say, a Google spreadsheet, we do have a new feature called Webhooks, which allow us to use a webhook endpoint to send that data to another system. Oftentimes, I see users utilizing Zapier as a middleman to send that data from the webhook to a Google Sheet. So this is going to be available on our new pricing plans, the Pro and Scale plan. Under your apps and APIs, under the gear icon, you will have webhooks enabled at that point, and you're going to have, again, those action events for a property webhook for when it's created, and then you can also have one for when field updates are made on that property. Maybe you also want to send that out to another system. This is going to be more of an advanced setup, and so on this one, we have gone through in several webinars, kind of start to finish, how to use the webhook tool and functionality with a system like Zapier. So I would probably start there as far as the initial overview of what this webhook feature entails. And then we do have those articles that go through step-by-step setting this up. So again, I would want to know your use case there. What information do you need to have stored in that Google Sheet? That may help clarify the best route to getting that information to that sheet itself. So feel free to reach out to support on that one. We may be able to give a better recommendation based on what exactly you're looking to do. It looks like that's the follow-up question that we have here as well.
Yeah, part 2 would be check out your plan and
created.
billing. Make sure that you're on that new pricing plan, because that's how you're going to be able to get access to those webhooks. You can check out your plan and billing within open to close. You just need to navigate to the person icon, plan and billing, and see there, whether you're on the pro plan, like Jana said, or the scale plan.
And if you're ever unsure too, we should have some articles on how to do that. But profile, you're going to see plan and billing if you're the account owner under this tab.
Perfect.
With that, it does look like you have a secondary follow-up, not just for intake forms, but all forms created. So again, I'm kind of curious use case. Intake forms are the main forms that we have directly inside open to close. So if you want to send in a ticket Ariel on what information you're looking to send to that spreadsheet, I think that will help clarify things. But main thing with webhooks that I want to stress here is when I look at this property created, property field updated webhook, it is pulling the property field information through this webhook. That is the main information that pulls through. It does not pull document information, contact information with that hook. If you need to try and pull more details than just fields, you are typically working with the API instead. So that's what we would want to clarify with your setup before we proceed with a better recommendation. Next question, can you show one more time how to go to the help box? Yes, for sure. So no matter where you're at in open to close, you should see a little chat window in the bottom right-hand corner. When you click on that, it's going to give you the option to see some home details. I can easily search for some articles, send a message. When I click that send a message, it's going to pop open a screen where I can type up my chat. And it's then going to send that to our support team where we can then respond to help you out accordingly. With our chats, typically our business hours are going to be 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. We will be available to help with chats during that time. Otherwise, we'll get back to you next business day typically. After that, the other option is this messages tab as well. You can see your message history if you've sent in some back and forth emails. The other option is just to send an email to help@opentoclose.com. That should also forward over to our team where we can assist you. Last question here. My brokerage likes to keep track of all of our answers in our forms in a yearly Google Sheet just to keep track. Perfect. So one thing I would consider with that is I do have some export capabilities. So if this is an end of year audit, I would consider that as an option, maybe every quarter, every month, every year, whatever your interval is, I could do an export of the properties in my account and the field information on them. So that would be maybe an option I would consider for what you guys are doing with that there, where I can create a table and what we call a segment to say, here's the criteria, the filter details of what information I want to pull into this view. So let's say your brokerage team wants to track all closed properties. I would create a new table, closed properties 2022. Now, I went pretty big with or granular with this bucket. Typically, your table is a very big bucket, and I can narrow down results in that big bucket with a segment. So keep that in mind. But once I have my table created, I can then change the filter parameters. So in this case, I would be using my contract status. I just want to have my closed selected here. Now, let's say I also wanted to see my expired listings or maybe my terminated transactions too. That is up to you on what options you select here. Once I have that selected, you can see those search results adjusted based on my criteria. I also want to say I just want to see my 2022 closings. So at that point, let's select my date range. I can choose year to date. In this case, it's already 2023. So I'm going to hard code this so I can get very specific. And I'm going to say January 1st to the 31st will be my date range. Once I select that, I don't want to base it off of created date. I mean, you certainly could based on what your team is doing. I may want to get more accurate with that though and change my date range option to be based on closed date instead. So once I have a date range selected, I can change this filter field. If I don't have a date range selected, it will only let me select created date. Keep that in mind. Once I have that set though, now it's going to show me all of my 2022 closings in this view. Now, because I had a table selected here, all of these filter parameters are saved on this table. So if I toggle to my active pendings, you can see my criteria is different. So this is why it may be a good option for you, because you could just have one table that you create and you, again, do that export every month, every quarter, whatever makes the most sense, but still be able to easily toggle to your normal everyday filter views. The last thing that you would want to set up with this table is what columns, what field information do you need to pull on that export. When you click table columns, it's going to show you all of the fields that you can select on the left-hand side, and then all of the current fields that are selected. You can drag and drop that order, you can remove a field, and you can easily add a field to that list. The columns that you see on this property view is what's going to be included when I hit this export CSV. So this may be a good option if you don't want to go through the webhooks or through the API, but still get a backup of your yearly transactions in the system. So, and hope that helps. But again, feel free to reach out to support take a deeper look at what data points you need to have on that Google Sheet to point you in the right direction.
The only other thing I would add is that if you need it to be in Google. Now, if you're okay with staying in open and close, on the new pricing plan, we do have the reporting tool. So on the reporting tool, you could say, I want to pull these very specific fields. I want to pull this report out of the whole entire year. I need to know how many times we answered, are we handling an HOA? So specifically, if you're looking for like the questions on that intake form, you can create it where you're pulling in this, and here you can see the agents, the users, you can, so reporting is another option as well, if you wanted to keep it within open to close. If it's that you absolutely need it in Google Sheets, because there's something specific that you do with that, exporting, webhooks, perfect. But if you're cool with using it within open to close, reporting could be a easy solution, like a quick solution for your brokerage.
Definitely. Yeah.
And we kind of,
Otherwise,
I feel like we glaze over this one a lot just because it is a newer feature. So I wanted,
yeah, I would
that's why I
say
wanted to make
definitely,
sure.
yeah, next Wednesday, and we're a bit over, so I'm not gonna have enough time to go in today, but I would say next Wednesday workshop, if you guys are able to attend, we can do a deep dive into reporting, but we do have a very thorough article on that as well. I know I keep directing you here, but there are some really fun updates with our articles that should be helpful for you guys. So keyword reporting, you're going to see a reporting overview, and it's going to show you how to build those reports step by step. And so definitely play around with this if you guys have not already. Again, this is only on version 2 pricing. So if you're not on version 2, you will not see this as an option, but we can certainly get you over to it if you're interested. So reach out to support, let us know how we can help. Otherwise, thank you guys so much for attending. We hope you have a wonderful first month of the year. So we'll see you next time for our next workshop. Otherwise, happy Wednesday.
Happy Wednesday.
Thanks, guys.